part of the discussion on the AESIs that are very brief, we will have a discussion by Keith on pulmonary function. So next slide, please. So on the 3101 study, the ASIs that were reported in the period from March to 31st May, oh, bless you. There were 2 new ASIs reported. So we can be very brief here. There was no cardiac event. There were no pulmonary toxicities, no hepatotoxicity, no macular edema. There was 1 malignancy reported. That was 1 basal cell carcinoma on the back. The cell carcinoma, it was excised, recovered, and the patient continues on treatment. There was 1 opportunistic infection, 1 herpes zoster. It was mild, and on the right arm, patient was treated with valacyclovir, and the IP was continued during treatment. And the event is still ongoing. It started on 30th May, so that was very recent. Then in the 3102 study, next slide, please. So in the 3102 study, there was 1 new ASI reported, and I just so this was also a basal cell carcinoma. It was moderate. I don't have the location, and it is ongoing since May 20th, and the IP is continued and the patient is on treatment. So these are the 3 ASIs that we have to report. I have none of them we will talk about in more detail. I think they are self-explanatory. We will now go to Keith talking about pulmonary effects. And after his discussion on the pulmonary effects, we will then move to the SESI by Laura. So,
hi, can I just ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, it's Gil here. I just, I think it came up before, but I'm curious about the zoster event with the patient continuing IP. Is there any kind of guidance given about what to do with IP in an event of a zoster infection?
About what infection?
Any so is there any instructions for investigators?
No, and there's no, I think we had this question before at this meeting, and there is no indication given to the PI if they should stop treatment or they should or continue. So there's no. This is really left to the PI. We have probably a half and half split. Some PIs prefer to stop treatment, and others continue, and there's no difference seen in outcome.
Yeah, we just recently included it as an adverse drug reaction, so it's in the updated IB.
You told us that last time, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so it's listed, and because of the long half-life of the active metabolite, and the fact that most of the patients, almost all the patients, continued on treatment and they resolved with the normal course of treatment, and they resolved while continuing on IP. It wasn't felt that it was necessary, at least, to make that decision to discontinue treatment because it would take so long anyway for them to get off active drug. But it is certainly listed as an adverse drug reaction now.
Sorry, Keith, can you remind us what is the half-life?
11 days for 2273. So the half-life for 2273, which is the predominant active half-life, is 11 days.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, it'd be weeks right before you get down to a low level of ALC, the pharmacodynamic effect.
Right, understood. Okay, all right, thank you.
All right. So I just wanted to really go quickly in terms of the pulmonary function test with the spirometry, because this had come up on the Crohn's disease data monitoring committee in terms of a couple of cases, and we'll be getting back to you on those cases. And then I just have a few slides to show you some data that we have and that we've used now for our submissions, both in the U.S. as well as in Europe, with regard to the spirometry in the MS population. And this is done because, as a class, the S1Ps have been shown to have some preclinical changes, although they're reversible, with some increased lung weight as well as alveolar macrophages that, on discontinuation in the animals, it goes away. But nonetheless, we see some similar findings, although some differences as well in the non-clinical animal models. So we continued with examination of pulmonary function tests with spirometry as well as DLCO in all of the clinical studies. So if you go to the next slide, this is the FEV1, so the spirometry data that we have in the MS population, where we have about 2,600 patients who were treated with either ozanimod or Avonex, interferon, and we followed them throughout the course of the study, just as we are with the IBD program, and looked at PFT starting at month 3, and you can see some small changes in FEV1. The next slide will be FVC, but you don't have to show that quite yet. And then after month 3, there seems to be no real difference when we plotted this out, looking at the figure between ozanimod and Avonex over the course after 3 months. So there's a small change that you see early relative to Avonex, and if you go to the next slide, in the spirometry, that's consistent. We've seen with FVC as well. That's almost exactly the same when you look at what fingolimod actually reports in their label and in their medical summary and summary basis of approval, with about a 2.5% change over the course of 24 months with ozanimod, and almost all of the difference between ozanimod and Avonex is actually from the first 3 months. So we think we see something very, very similar, which is really small, not clinically significant, because we looked at, if you go to the next slide, adverse event profiles. We looked at cutoffs in terms of outliers. We looked at patients who did have actually more significant drops and seeing if they reported adverse events, looked at what happened over a longer period of time for patients who continued, and really see very little in terms of any respiratory symptoms or alignment of any pulmonary changes with any of the respiratory symptoms. We think a lot of this that you see in terms of variation, and that was picked up at the DMC meeting last time with Crohn's disease, is related to some of the variability that's at the site, even though they all have qualified equipment. These are not centrally read pulmonary function testing with spirometry, but they are nevertheless done hopefully by sites, and we've qualified them and made sure that they have actual adequate equipment to be able to read this. But again, it's not a centrally read monitoring system. So if you go to the next slide, what we've talked about internally, and also I think I had a follow-up conversation with Lauren, about our medical monitoring plan, so that we can make sure that we're following these patients closely, not just leaving it, to discretion from the medical monitoring, but a couple of things here. So number one, we have absolute discontinuation criteria at the very end here of with less than 50% predicted for FEV1 or FVC or DLCO for that matter. And we also have an absolute requirement that they have a 70% predicted to get in in the first place. So what we're going to institute in the medical monitoring plan is that the medical monitor will follow up with the sites for any significant reductions in FEV1 or FVC. So if they're less than 80% of baseline and they also have less than 70% of predicted, they will be asked a series of questions with relation to adverse events, dyspnea, hypoxia, or other causes that may be responsible for a change. And then they will also be requested to repeat that assessment, that spirometry, at the next follow-up visit. So they won't be waiting, because I know that was one of the questions that had come up at the Crohn's DMC, was that there seemed to be a wait that we had expected for those follow-up, but in those particular patients and any that come up in the future, we will be asking the sites to follow up with additional requests for spirometry at the next visit for the patient. Of course, if the patient is symptomatic, because we'll be asking right away when we get these values that are low, we'll be asking if the patient is symptomatic, and if they are, then they should have appropriate follow-up and evaluation, as required by the investigator, and perhaps a pulmonary consultation if needed. So this purpose of increased safety surveillance will be taken up in the medical monitoring plan, and this is what we've outlined, and wanted to present that to you to make sure this sort of meets with your satisfaction for us to move forward with. And hopefully this is okay. If you want to think about it and talk about it in your closed session, or get back to us later.
It says Keith. It says request repeat assessment the next visit, meaning repeat PFT testing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Repeat. We can make that clear. Repeat request PFT assessment at the next visit, right, for when they meet these criteria.
Because again, then as follow-up, and this is admittedly a PI doesn't have to pay attention to you, but just the way it's written, it says follow-up decisions to be made based upon PI's clinical assessment. So, one just might make a little stronger that request repeat, PFT and follow-up decisions after PFT to be made based upon PIs.
Right, that's what's meant here, is that after, so we will definitely have that request made, that they follow up, at the next visit with spirometry, and then after that, a decision will be made by the PI based on clinical assessment, or, if that was just a spurious, or if it in fact is real, then a decision, can be made to discontinue the patient or to refer them for a pulmonary evaluation. So, that's what I'll clarify that. We can clarify that sub-bullet.
Okay.
For sure. So that's kind of what I just wanted to let you know, that we heard you loud and clear, and we're following up specifically on those two cases in the Crohn's, and you'll hear about that, Lauren and Gil, at the next meeting for Crohn's for the DMC, and then this is what we're planning to do in terms of medical monitoring across the ozanimod IBD program.
Keith, thanks. It's Gil. I have a question. I appreciate the diligence here and going through the data and coming up with proposed monitoring strategy. But could you go back to the data slide?
Yep. Right. Okay, which one? Yeah, so a slide, one more back, right?
One more back.
Okay.
I just want to make sure I understand. So, like, the N drops a lot for month 18 and then goes back up again in month 24. I'm just curious, does that make sense?
Yeah, so these, okay, yeah, so we probably shouldn't even have the 18. Right, so they were required, so depending on which study it was, so the MS study had one 24-month study and one study that was at least 12 months, so they waited for that last patient out. So last patient out for month 12, and then all those patients rolled over into an open label extension, right? So there was actually two pivotal phase 3 trials in the MS program. One